on November 13th, 2024, I drove up to the Wayne Art Center to view a remarkable exhibition.
My name is Scott Noel. I want to welcome you to this show called Eternal Recurrence at the Wayne Art Center, which is a summation of 40 years of my interest in making figure composition.
Some of these paintings were featured in his show last spring at Gross McLeave Gallery, but to see them in this amazing space took my breath away. Scott told me that he was thrilled with the high ceilings and excellent combination of natural and artificial lighting. He wanted to express his profound thanks to the Wayne Art Center for this milestone opportunity. Scott and I ended up talking about matters both philosophical and technical, but first he wanted to read some stanzas from Rainer Maria Rilke's Ninth Elegy.
Why, if this interval of being can be spent serenely in the form of a laurel, slightly darker than all other green, with tiny waves on the edges of every leaf, like the smile of a breeze, why then have to be human, and, escaping from fate, keep longing for fate? Oh, not because happiness exists, that too hasty prophet snatched from approaching loss, not out of curiosity, not as practice for the heart, which would exist in the laurel too, but because truly being here is so much, because everything here apparently needs us, this fleeting world which in some strange way keeps calling to us the most fleeting of all. Once for each thing, just once, no more, and we too, just once, and never again. But to have been this once, completely, even if only once, to have been at one with the earth, seems beyond undoing.
Do you feel that way about art, that even art is impermanent?
It is in the long term, but time slows in works of art. And there's a way in which a work of art, with a little bit of luck, might survive its maker, at least for a little while. And I think all art stands in the sign of being. That is something that is more durable than the reality of becoming, which is our lived experience. Everything that we experience in the world is arising and passing away before us, including ourselves. So a work of art is a bizarre glacier in which experience maybe comes to rest and might be preserved and maybe ever so slightly ordered and perfected so that it can be shared with others.
Scott, how do I put this delicately? We're not getting any younger. Some of these paintings, when you were doing them, you were more or less the same age as your models.
You're right. The earliest in the show is 40 years ago. I'm in the painting, and I'm a young person like the people I continually paint. In some of my paintings that were done just a year or so ago, I'm also in the paintings, but now I'm in my late 60s. I tend to present myself in my paintings like Dorian Gray. I don't exactly age in the pictures, which actually is the reverse of Dorian Gray. But my actual lived self is showing signs of wear and tear.
This pursuit of youth, do you ever get over that?
The reason youth is such a subject in these paintings is it is an emblem of physical perfection, of physical beauty, something that I want to preserve in the arc of a work of art, because they will not always be that way, but they will be in the paintings.
Scott made a fascinating comment about the composition of his monumental paintings.
I was creating, on some level, over a 30-year period, my own Parthenon frieze.
In other words, a parade of horizontally arranged figures moving across a relatively shallow proscenium. Why were you drawn to that particular design scheme?
Either you're struck by those things or you're not. The frieze structure, which, by the way, the Greeks did not invent, but the Greeks combined the hieratic processional rhythms of frieze sculpture with recognizable actual bodies arranged in these silhouettes where there's very little front to back change in scale. So space is achieved not by perspective, but it's achieved by overlap. And then the other thing that's so characteristic of those friezes is the poetry of interval. So you have a sense of the silhouette of a figure, and then it's met by a caesura or a break, and then another figure. And what you find is those intervals between the figures have as much beauty as the figures themselves. They are like the spaces in music or the breaths in poetry. Not every painter is sensitive to that, but the painters I like, Velázquez, Titian, Veronese, Poussin, Degas, they have a sense of the grandeur of this kind of visual poetry. The problem is, how do you renew a beautiful visual musicality in a way that seems relevant to your lived experience? And that's what I've tried to do with these playground pictures.
High-speed photography can freeze a body in motion, but you're not using photography at all. How do you make your figures in motion appear so believable?
All of the figures are posed. Every model is usually standing on some kind of ladder or a large table where the middle of their body is about at the level of my eye. So half of their body is above my eye level and half of their body is below. All of the poses are essentially contrapposto, where the weight is a little bit more on one leg than the other, and the body is torqued accordingly in a reciprocal energy in relation to that weight-bearing leg. And those poses, all the way back to ancient Greece, are just incredibly musical. They have a set of countervailing diagonals that are just beautiful. So that's what I'm always doing. And what I learned is if I take even a simple standing pose and I detach it from its normal location on the ground, it's amazing how much we will accept the reality of certain impossible things if the light and the proportions are believable. And a lot of my interpretation of proportion is tied to contingent observation. I'm a certain distance from a figure where the proportions are shaped by my viewpoint. The template for a lot of my sense of silhouette in the figures goes back to the 60s and 70s when I would look at Sports Illustrated. Photographers were using telephoto lenses, so they would be 100 feet away from the action. And what happens is you get much more of a frieze sculpture's regularity of scale in the silhouette. It's like you could cut out a group of figures and just move them like playing cards on top of or in front of each other, and just overlap would make the space work. So starting with a space where I'll put a figure, so I have to figure out how the figure would be credibly scaled in relation to the space. But it's like cutting out beautiful silhouettes of figures and then moving them around in front of a processional space, a series of overlapping planes, a horizon line, and waiting to see a shape intersection that looks good. Artists from Praxiteles all the way up to Kehinde Wiley do the same thing. It is ancient artistic pictorial stagecraft.
Now, very nuts and bolts. You have a guy jumping for a basketball. You have a model who's supposed to be doing that.
Well, in the painting called Earl Monroe and Bobby Jones, there's a really handsome African-American man reaching to block my shot. That is now a very famous artist named Art Monroe Niles.
Scott, I'm going to interrupt you for a second and show the audience a few of Art's paintings. I got to meet him when he was an Academy student. Incredibly good guy. Now, you were saying?
When he modeled for me in 2013, he stood on a table in profile, almost like an Egyptian god striding across the model stand. And I start with the core of the body, the shorts, the lower torso, the thighs. Then I might ask Art to open his legs just slightly and maybe go up on tiptoe on one foot or the other. And then to lean back with his torso, so there's a little bit of an arch in the lower back, and I'll start building up to his shoulders. And then I'll put an easel up on the table, and can you raise your hand and just rest it on the crossbar of the easel so I can look at that extended hand? And could you throw your head back so it looks as if you are stretching to block this player's shot? We'll get it step by step, working from the core. What you see on the canvas is one day of painting.
Scott, that's just amazing.
I've been doing it for a long, long time, and I have a sense of a template for the pose that I'm seeking, which then the individual model can fulfill. And I'll accept all the particularities of their proportions, their likeness, their clothing. But the bony armature of the pose is something that had to do with learning how to draw skeletons from memory 45 years ago.
Frank Auerbach, the great British painter, just died. Even though his work is quite a bit more abstract than yours, both of you have this obsession with painting being about paint.
Paint is beautiful stuff. It's beautiful to handle, to move around. It does these amazing things. That's the gateway into that fascination. But over time, paint becomes so encrusted with metaphorical potential. If you're moving this stuff on a surface, but you're trying to evoke a space or a light or movement or human presence, any of the things that painting has done for millennia. So when you get into it, you encounter all the ways that painting could and does encode consciousness of physical experiences. But how it does that is really, really interesting and very particular for each artist. For me, it has been the richest part of my imagination, my understanding of history and literature, even lately science and mathematics, has come from the field of play with what paint can do to evoke my lived, primarily visual experience, but also my tactile experience.
You render your forms sometimes with great detail, but often quite loosely. But no matter how you do it, tightly or with great abbreviation, the believability is always right on the money. How have you gotten so good at accurately representing what you see?
Well, it's incredibly kind of you to say that. The reason it's developed as such a strong muscle in my work is from repetition. Because of painting from life, the opportunity to see something, to see the light on a landscape, the visitation of a beautiful young person in the studio, those are fleeting events. They don't last long, and they can close of a sudden. Every time I paint, I'm painting as if this is the last day and the last occasion, and maybe my final word as a painter. I've learned to try to pack as much information and commitment into each thing that I do.
What are you trying to express about humanity in your paintings?
Well, I've always, from childhood on, had faith in human goodness, which I encounter all the time in my lived experiences. People repay generosity and decency, generally speaking, with generosity and decency. The only thing that I think comes in the way of most human beings' best selves is fear. Fear makes people do ungenerous things and look to their own interests in destructive ways. Art, for me, is an affirmation of human beings' essentially gift-giving nature. If you're not afraid, if your needs are met, if you're doing in life what you think you're most able to do, there's a deep desire to share that with others. Artists are wealthy in their capacities, not necessarily in their material assets. And when you have capacities that make you feel superabundant or wealthy, not that I do, but I understand the psychology, you want to share it. And I think that's one of my hopes maybe for humanity, is that more people get to feel powerful in what they do rather than in what they have.
Are you content that you were born human instead of a laurel tree? And if so, why?
One of the greatest gifts you can have is knowing what you really want. And if I have one overriding gift, it's I've always known what I really wanted. And it was this work.